Hi, today's video is about CELP standard number 1, which focuses on comprehension. And our learning target for today is to recognize different ways of making text comprehensible for English learners at different levels of language proficiency. So now let's look at the proficiency descriptors for CELP standard 1. CELP tells us that allows level 1 learner, if given appropriate prompts and supports, can identify a few keywords in texts. A level 2 learner, again with prompting and supports, can identify the main idea. They can retell a few key details and also explain how these details support the main topic. A level 3 learner with guidance and supports can identify the central idea. They can explain how this idea is developed by giving specific details from the text, and they can also summarize parts of the text. So this is very important because this tells us that maybe sometimes we do need to modify our expectations when it comes to certain tasks. For example, if we ask our learners, if the task is requiring the students to cite specific details or give evidence from the text to support their ideas, to support their analysis, well, they cannot do that if they are level ones, twos, or threes. They can only do that if they are a level four. And reflecting on our English language profile at Danbury High School, we don't have many level fours that are still considered as ESL students. So please keep this in mind that maybe when it comes to some assignments, some tasks, we will have to modify the expectations as well as the texts. Okay, so how do we make sure our texts are comprehensible for our English learners? Well, we got two ways to do this. The first one is we can modify how our students are going to interact with the original text without changing anything in the text itself. And this is a quick way of making sure texts are accessible for our English learners. This strategy is helpful when we have a text that we plan on using only for a short amount of time, so maybe only for one block. Or maybe when we have multiple texts that our students are required to read to form an opinion. If that's the case, then the first thing we should do is to reduce the number of texts that the students will be required to read. So, for example, if you have 6 texts that you plan on giving your students before they can form an opinion about a topic, then reduce that number to maybe 2 or 3 by eliminating some of the texts that have overlapping information in them. And then you can modify how your students are going to interact with those remaining 2 or 3 texts. The next way of making sure our texts are comprehensible is to modify the text itself. And yes, I do realize modifying the text requires more planning time. However, it is very helpful when we plan on using the same text for an extended amount of time and when we plan on asking our students to do various tasks based on one single text. If that's the case, we need to take our time and modify the text itself. For those of you who may be thinking if you can or if you should modify primary sources or maybe literature, my answer to that question is always, of course, absolutely. Please feel free to modify your sources, and based on your planning, you may just choose to modify how your students are going to interact with that primary source, or you may just go ahead and embed some linguistic supports to modify the source itself. And those of you wondering, what if the primary source or literature is too challenging no matter what you do? And my response to that thought would be we have 2 options. The first option is we can provide an alternate text. So instead of reading the primary source, our English learners can read an alternative text that encompasses similar information with the primary source itself. And then the second option we have is we can provide summaries. So what we can do is we can chunk the primary source in different sections, and after each section, we can provide a short summary of the information contained in that previous section to make it more accessible for our English learners. Okay, now let's look at a sample modified student interaction. On my screen right now, you see the original text as well as 3 different versions based on last levels. These materials are also available to you on your participant notebooks, page 7. When we want to modify how our students interact with the original text, what we essentially do is we annotate the text, and we also put in some scaffolds in the margins to help our learners. We can choose to do this by hand, or we can use some online tools like Kami or DocHub if you want to go digital. Now, let's look at these materials in more depth. This text is from our Social Studies Modern World curriculum. It's one of the texts that the students need to read as part of an end of unit assessment. And after they read the text, students are to write down the main idea, list the characteristics of nationalism mentioned in the primary source here, and also decide if this source shows that nationalism divides or unites. So now let's look at how we can modify the interaction of a LAS Level 3 learner with this text. First of all, we highlight the important sections of the text using a highlighter or a digital tool, and then we direct our students to read only the highlighted sections. The next thing we can do is we can put in some extra questions in the margins just to help with understanding. These questions do not aim to test how much students understand, but the goal is to help them understand the text even better. And the next thing we can do is we can move some of the questions into the margins. So instead of asking them to list the national characteristics of nationalism right here in this box, we can just direct the students into to a particular section in the text to make it easier for them. We can also provide some bullet pointed supports just to hint them how many characteristics they need to list. And the remaining questions can be listed underneath the text itself. Now let's look at Ella's level 2 version. Again, we do the same thing. We highlight the text. However, this time the highlighted sections are shorter than what Ella's level 3 learner will receive. And we still can include some extra questions. However, we just need to provide some more supports, maybe turn them into a multiple choice question. And another support we can give them is maybe we can include a word bank so that they can answer one of the essential questions listed in the original task itself. The other support we can provide our students is because LAS level 2 learners are less proficient in their English levels, instead of asking them to write down the main idea, we can just ask them to underline 3 sentences in the text that best describe the main idea. And then finally, they can still decide whether this text shows that nationalism unites or divides. Okay, so now let's go down and look at it for a LAS level 1 learner. This looks considerably different from what it looked like in the other 2 versions, and this is because there is less text highlighted in this version. And this is because LAS level 1 learners are not as proficient as a LAS level 2 or 3 learner. One of the supports we can provide our level 1 learners is we can ask them to use a dictionary to translate the new words. And they will only focus on the highlighted sentences, so they don't need to worry about any of the unknown words in the remaining of the text. The other thing we can do is we can stack translate the directions to make sure they understand what to do. And also, finally, we can eliminate many of the questions in the original text. For example, we should not ask them to identify the main idea because CELP 1 proficiency descriptors tells us level 1 learners cannot do that. Starting LAS level 2, English learners are able to identify the main idea of a text with given supports and prompts. However, a LAS level 1 learner is not able to do so no matter what kind of supports we give them. So the only thing we can ask them here is that they can decide if this text shows that nationalism unites or divides. The strategies used to modify that sample student interaction are listed on page 6 of your participant notebooks. Please feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions. Now that we have looked at a sample modified student interaction, I now want to show you how we can modify the text itself. On my screen right now, you see the original text from our science curriculum and 3 different versions based on LAS levels. These materials are also available to you on your participant notebooks on page 15. Now let's look at these texts in more depth. This text is from our biology curriculum, and it is 1 page, and students are to read it to complete some different tasks. So when we look at how we can modify it for a LAS level 3 learner, we see that the text looks a little shorter. And this is one of the modifications that we can provide. We can delete inessential information to make the text a little bit shorter than the original text for our LAS level 3 learners. The next thing we can do is we can number the paragraphs, and this is very helpful for our English learners when they have to go back and reread a certain section of the text to answer a particular question. We can even refer them to the paragraph in the question when we write the question. Another thing we can do is we can rephrase the sentences in the original text with the goal of making them simpler. You have an example of how we can rephrase long sentences on page 11 of your participant notebooks. Next thing we can do is we can include labeled images, and we can use Google Drawings to create these images if you can't find anything online. This will help with comprehending the text, certain sections of the text. And another thing we can do is we can chunk the text in different sections and include subheadings to make it easier, again, for our English learners to locate the necessary information. And finally, we can include a glossary of important words or phrases with images to illustrate the meaning, and we can bold these items in the original text. Now let's go to a last level 2 version. As you will realize, this version has less text, and this is because, again, we deleted some of the inessential information to make it shorter. We still put in all the same supports that the last level 3 learner gets. Additional supports are uh, there are two. The first one is, instead of a whole paragraph here in this section, we turned it into bulleted information. This will help us teachers make sure the information in that particular section is more concise, and also will help our English learners understand the structure. And for example, when they first look at it, it is very easy to understand that there are three reasons why scientists are concerned. However, when we look at this paragraph, it takes a little bit more effort and requires more language to understand the different reasons for why the scientists are concerned. And finally, their glossary has one more item, again with images. And these items are in bold in the original text. Now let's go down to last level 1. As you can tell, the text now is much shorter, and this is because the proficiency descriptors for CALP standard number 1 tell us that level 1 learners can only identify a few key words, phrases, or details in a text. And as teachers, when we modify materials for our level 1 learners, we just need to make sure that we include only the most important information in a very simple sentence format. So it is really important to rephrase the sentences to make them even simpler. We can still provide them with some of the supports other levels are getting, such as labeled images or subheadings and a glossary. And their glossaries look different. The glossary has more items, and some of these items are translated into their native language just to give them more opportunities to clarify the meaning of these target words. The linguistic supports used to modify the sample reading text can be found starting page 11 of your notebooks, along with some tech tools that you can use when modifying reading texts. For video tutorials, please go to my Schoology course. And one more thing I want to mention uh, about modifying materials is that we need to be mindful about providing a friendly formatted material for our English learners. And we can do this by using some simple strategies listed here and turn our text heavy documents into more friendly versions. And this will help our English learners understand the text more easily and also feel less intimidated. Okay, now let's focus on translation of texts. While it is perfectly okay to provide strategic translation of keywords, questions, or headings, it is never okay to use Google Translation and translate the entire text. Instead, as we discussed in this video, we should be using some language supports to make sure the texts are comprehensible for our English learners. And if our students still need to clarify certain parts of the simplified text we provide them, then it's okay for them to use targeted translation just to help with clarification. And this is because too much translation boxes out our students from participating in class, and it also hinders their language development. This being said, stack translation for directions is very helpful for when we have to make sure our students understand what they are required to do. Now, let's look at a sample here. On my screen, you see a math word problem. First, this math problem was simplified in order to make it more accessible by using some certain linguistic supports. And then parts of this text, the material, was chunked in two different sections just to provide more scaffolding. And to make sure that students understand what they are required to do, certain sentences were translated using stack translation. Okay, today we have talked a lot about modifying materials, and Just as important is providing instructional supports to aid with reading comprehension. I have listed some strategies on page 21 of your notebooks for when you need to prepare your students for the words or ideas in the text, as well as when you have to support your students as they read the text. In this video, unfortunately, I don't have time to go through these items one by one. However, please feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions or if you need my help. Thank you so much for watching and have a good day.